When two cops ordered an old black man to move from his seat claiming he didn't belong there, no one expected the pilot to emerge from the cockpit 9 minutes later and salute him in front of everyone without saying a word. The morning sun filtered through the massive windows of Chicago O'Hare Terminal 3, casting long shadows across Gate B-17. It was 6:47 a.m., and the early boarding call for Delta Flight 447 to Atlanta had just echoed through the waiting area. Master Sergeant James "Jimmy" Washington sat perfectly upright in seat 12A, his weathered hands resting on a manila folder that had seen better days. At 72, Jimmy carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a man who had worn the uniform, shoulders squared, spine straight, eyes alert despite the early hour. He was dressed in his one good suit, navy blue with a thin black tie, the same outfit he'd worn to his wife's funeral 3 years ago. The folder in his lap contained papers he'd carried for 53 years, but never had the courage to deliver. Until today. Today, he was finally going to Atlanta to meet the family of Private Tony Castellanos, the young Marine he couldn't save in Vietnam. Jimmy had paid for seat 12A with money saved over 2 years from his small military pension. Not first class, but premium economy with the aisle seat his prosthetic leg required. The leg was hidden beneath his pressed slacks, a reminder of the day everything changed in a jungle clearing half a world away. Around him, other passengers settled into their seats. A businessman in an expensive suit kept glancing his way, whispering to his colleague. "Security's really lacking these days," Jimmy heard him say. The flight attendant had already checked Jimmy's boarding pass twice, each time asking if he needed help finding his correct seat. Jimmy was used to the looks, the assumptions, the quiet suggestions that he didn't belong. After 7 decades of life as a black man in America, he'd learned to maintain his dignity in the face of doubt. What they couldn't see was the Medal of Valor citation in that manila folder, or the Purple Heart and Bronze Star certificates tucked beneath. What they couldn't know was that this quiet old man had earned the right to sit anywhere through blood, courage, and sacrifice they couldn't imagine. The boarding process continued around him, but Jimmy's mind was already in Atlanta, rehearsing words he'd practiced for 53 years. "Mrs. Castellanos, my name is Jimmy Washington. I served with your brother Tony in Vietnam. I have something that belongs to your family." Jimmy closed his eyes briefly, letting the weight of memory wash over him. Vietnam, 1968. He'd been 25 then, a squad leader in the 1st Marines during the Tet Offensive. Young, strong, believing he was invincible. 2 tours of duty had taught him otherwise. It was during his 2nd tour that he met Private Tony Castellanos, barely 19, fresh-faced kid from Atlanta who talked constantly about his sister Maria. "She's going to be a teacher," Tony would say, showing everyone the letter he was writing home. "Gonna change the world, one kid at a time." Jimmy remembered the exact moment everything changed. February 14th, 1968. Their unit had been ambushed while on patrol near Hugh. Enemy fire had pinned them down in a rice paddy, and when an explosion collapsed part of a nearby bunker, Jimmy found himself trapped inside with Private Danny Chen and Tony Castellanos. The bunker was on fire. Jimmy had managed to pull Chen to safety first, dragging him through the smoke and debris despite taking shrapnel in his own leg. But when he went back for Tony, a second explosion brought down the rest of the structure. Jimmy had clawed at the rubble with his bare hands until his fellow Marines pulled him away, his left leg mangled beyond repair. Tony Castellanos died that day, clutching the letter he'd been writing to his sister. Jimmy had crawled back later after the fighting stopped and found the letter in Tony's pocket. The envelope was addressed to Maria Castellanos, 1247 Peachtree Street, Atlanta, Georgia, in Tony's careful handwriting. For 53 years, Jimmy had carried that letter. Through his medical discharge, through learning to walk again with a prosthetic, through meeting and marrying his beloved Sarah, through raising their children and grandchildren. Sarah had known about the letter, had gently encouraged him to deliver it. "That family deserves to know their boy was thinking of them at the end," she'd say. But Jimmy carried too much guilt. He was the squad leader. He should have saved them both. He should have reached Tony in time. How could he face a grieving family and explain that he'd failed their boy? Now, 3 years after Sarah's death from cancer, Jimmy finally understood what she'd been trying to tell him. This wasn't about his guilt. It was about giving a family the last words of someone they loved. The plane was filling up around him. He noticed the passengers, cataloging them the way his military training had taught him. The businessman who'd been whispering, Tom Bradley, according to his loud phone conversation, was settling into seat 8B. Dr. Patricia Williams, a distinguished black woman in her 50s, had taken seat 15C and was setting up her laptop. She'd glanced at Jimmy with recognition, not of who he was, but of what he might face on this flight. Jimmy also noticed the others, the ones most passengers wouldn't see. The young man in 23C with the perfect posture and short haircut. Military, probably active duty. The woman in 35A with the bearing of an officer. The older gentleman in 8D who'd nodded respectfully when Jimmy boarded. Another veteran, Jimmy was certain. Flight attendant Rebecca Martinez approached with her practiced smile. She was young, maybe 28, with the kind of crisp professionalism that masked unconscious bias. Jimmy had encountered her type before. Not malicious, just conditioned to see certain people as problems to be managed. "Sir, I just need to double-check something," she said, her tone polite but firm. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Jimmy looked up calmly, handed her his boarding pass. "Yes, ma'am. Seat 12A. I booked it specifically for the aisle access." Rebecca studied the pass longer than necessary, frowning slightly. "And this is your seat? You purchased this yourself?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Jimmy felt the familiar weight of assumption, the quiet suggestion that someone like him couldn't possibly afford premium seating. He kept his voice steady, respectful. "Yes, ma'am. Saved up for this trip. It's important." "I see." Rebecca's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Well, we've had some irregularities today with seating assignments. I may need to make some adjustments." Jimmy's military bearing straightened just slightly. "Ma'am, I paid for this seat. I have the receipt if you'd like to see it." "That won't be necessary right now," Rebecca said, already moving away. "I'll let you know if any changes are needed." As she walked away, Jimmy caught Tom Bradley watching the exchange with interest. The businessman leaned over to his seatmate, speaking in a voice just loud enough to be heard. "I tell you, standards have really slipped. When I pay premium prices, I expect a certain quality of passenger." Jimmy folded his hands over the manila folder and closed his eyes. Sarah's voice echoed in his memory. "Keep your dignity, baby. No matter what they throw at you, you keep your dignity. That's what makes you stronger than their hate." The plane was almost ready for departure. Jimmy's mission was simple. Deliver Tony's letter to Maria, ask her forgiveness for taking 53 years to bring her brother home, and finally lay down the burden he'd carried for more than half his life. He had no idea that in 9 minutes, everything would change. Tom Bradley had been watching Jimmy for the past 10 minutes, his irritation growing with each glance. Finally, he unbuckled his seatbelt and approached Rebecca, who was checking overhead bins near the front of the plane. "Excuse me, miss," Bradley said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting his way. "I need to speak with you about the passenger in 12A." Rebecca turned, recognizing the tone of a frequent flyer with status. "Yes, Mr. Bradley? How can I help you?" "That man doesn't belong in this section," Bradley said, gesturing toward Jimmy. "I've been flying this route for 15 years, and I pay premium prices specifically to avoid this kind of element. Someone obviously made a mistake." Rebecca glanced toward Jimmy, who sat quietly reading a paperback book, the manila folder in his lap. "Sir, he does have a valid boarding pass for that seat." "I don't care what he's got," Bradley pressed. "I saw him arguing with the gate agent earlier. He was agitated, probably trying to scam his way into a better seat. This kind of person, they always think rules don't apply to them. The words hung in the air, coded but clear. Rebecca felt the familiar discomfort of being asked to make a decision she wasn't trained for. Company policy was clear about guest services, but Tom Bradley was a Diamond Elite member with significant influence. I'll go speak with him again, Rebecca said finally. See if there's been any confusion. She walked back to Jimmy's row, her smile now noticeably strained. Sir, I need to double-check your boarding pass again. We've had some irregularities today. Jimmy looked up from his book, noting the change in her demeanor. Is there a problem, ma'am? How exactly did you afford this seat? The question came out more bluntly than Rebecca intended. I mean, did someone help you with the booking? Was this perhaps an upgrade you weren't expecting? The implication was clear as glass. Jimmy set down his book carefully, his voice remaining calm and respectful. Ma'am, I saved for 2 years to afford this trip. I paid full price for this seat because I have a prosthetic leg and need the aisle access. Are you traveling alone? Rebecca continued, her questions taking on the rhythm of an interrogation. Did someone help you with this booking? This section typically requires special qualifications. Dr. Patricia Williams, seated several rows back, had been listening to the exchange with growing alarm. She'd heard this tone before, seen this dynamic play out in hospitals, airports, restaurants. She quietly activated her phone's recording function and sent a quick text to her colleague. Witnessing racial profiling on Flight 447. Jimmy maintained his composure, answering each question with military precision. Yes, ma'am, I'm traveling alone. No, ma'am, nobody helped me book this. I purchased this seat online using my debit card. I can show you the confirmation email if needed. We need to verify this wasn't a booking error, Rebecca said, her voice gaining confidence as other passengers began to take notice of the interaction. This section has specific requirements, and we can't have passengers who might make others uncomfortable. The words hit like a physical blow. Jimmy felt the familiar sting of discrimination wrapped in corporate policy. Around them, passengers were starting to stare. Some looked uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. Others, like Tom Bradley, watched with satisfied approval. Ma'am, Jimmy said quietly, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of command. I fought for this country in Vietnam. I believe I've earned the right to sit wherever I've paid to sit. The response rippled through the nearby seats. Dr. Williams felt her breath catch. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably, but Tom Bradley's voice rose above the murmur. I saw him arguing with gate staff earlier. He might be a security risk. Rebecca's eyes widened. The word security changed everything. Following protocol drilled into every flight attendant since 9/11, she reached for her communication device. I need to call for assistance, she announced, loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. Ma'am, I'm not causing any trouble, Jimmy said, his voice still calm, but carrying a note of steel. I'm simply trying to get to Atlanta to honor a promise I made 53 years ago. But Rebecca was already speaking into her device. We have a passenger situation in 12A, requesting security assistance for an agitated passenger refusing to cooperate with crew instructions. Jimmy felt the walls closing in, felt the familiar weight of assumptions and prejudice bearing down on him. But Sarah's voice echoed in his memory. Keep your dignity, baby. That's what makes you stronger than their hate. He straightened in his seat, the manila folder secure in his hands, and waited for whatever came next. In the folder, Tony Castellanos' final letter rested alongside Jimmy's Medal of Valor citation, 2 pieces of paper that told the real story of who James Washington was. But nobody on Flight 447 knew that story yet. Airport police officers Martinez and Johnson strode down the jet bridge with the purposeful gait of men responding to a potential security threat. Officer Martinez, a stocky man in his 30s with close-cropped hair and perpetually narrowed eyes, led the way. Officer Johnson, slightly older and carrying the weathered look of someone who'd seen too much, followed reluctantly. They boarded the aircraft and immediately located Rebecca, who pointed toward Jimmy's seat. "That's him, officers. Passenger in 12A. He's been agitated, questioning our policies, and other passengers have expressed concerns about his behavior." Martinez approached Jimmy's row with the aggressive confidence of someone who'd already decided how this encounter would end. "Sir, we need you to come with us. Now." Jimmy looked up calmly, his book still open in his lap, the manila folder resting beside him. "Is there a problem, officer?" "You're the problem," Martinez said, his voice carrying across the cabin. "Stand up. You're coming with us." Johnson shifted uncomfortably behind his partner, recognizing the signs of an encounter that was escalating unnecessarily, but protocol dictated following his partner's lead. Jimmy remained seated, his voice steady and respectful. "Officer, I'm not resisting anything. I'm simply sitting in the seat I paid for, waiting for this flight to take off. If I've done something wrong, could you please tell me what it is?" "People like you need to understand your place," Martinez snapped, his patience already exhausted. "When airline personnel tell you to move, you move. When police tell you to stand up, you stand up." The phrase, "people like you," cut through the cabin like a blade. Several passengers looked up from their phones and magazines. Dr. Williams's recording continued, capturing every word. Tom Bradley, emboldened by police presence, called out from his seat, "Finally, someone's handling this situation properly." "Officer," Jimmy said quietly, "I've shown my boarding pass multiple times. I've answered every question politely. I'm not disturbing anyone. I'm just trying to get to Atlanta." "I don't care what you claim you need to do," Martinez shot back. "And I don't care what you claim you did overseas. Every troublemaker has some sob story." The dismissal of Jimmy's military service hung in the air like smoke. Around the cabin, several passengers exchanged glances. In row 23, Marine Lance Corporal David Chen straightened in his seat, his trained ear picking up the reference to overseas service. In row 35, Coast Guard Lieutenant Sarah Morrison felt her jaw tighten. Jimmy slowly began to rise from his seat, his prosthetic leg requiring careful movement. As he stood, the manila folder shifted in his hands, and several passengers could see the corner of an official document with government letterhead. "Officer," Jimmy said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command, "I'm not resisting. I'm not causing a disturbance. I'm simply trying to get to Atlanta to deliver a letter to a Gold Star family, the family of a Marine who died in my arms 53 years ago." Martinez's face flushed with irritation. "Old man, you people always think rules don't apply to you. You think you can play the victim and get whatever you want. Get up now, or we'll remove you." The phrase, "you people," struck the cabin like lightning. Dr. Williams gasped audibly. Several passengers reached for their phones. The tension that had been building for the past 10 minutes suddenly crystallized into something sharp and dangerous. But it was Jimmy's response that changed everything. He stood to his full height, the prosthetic leg now visible beneath his slacks, the manila folder clutched in hands that bore the scars of half a century of hard work. His voice was calm, dignified, and carried the unmistakable authority of a man who had led other men into battle. "Son, I've been ordered around by better men than you," Jimmy said quietly. "I'll move wherever you want me to move, but I want it noted that I'm being removed from a seat I paid for while trying to honor a fallen Marine. And I want it noted that you just called a Medal of Valor recipient, 'you people.'" The words fell into the cabin like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread from seat to seat. The manila folder had shifted again, and now several passengers could see the gold seal of a military citation partially visible among the papers. Martinez faltered for a moment, uncertainty flickering across his face. Medal of Valor. That was serious. That was the kind of thing that could end a career if mishandled. But Tom Bradley's voice cut through his hesitation. "Don't let him manipulate you with war stories. Just remove the troublemaker so we can get on with our flight." Martinez grabbed Jimmy's arm. "That's enough. You're coming with us now." As he did, the manila folder slipped from Jimmy's hands, papers scattering across the aisle. Dr. Williams, moving quickly, helped gather them, and as she did, she saw what Jimmy had been carrying, a Medal of Valor citation, a Purple Heart certificate, a Bronze Star with V device, and a letter addressed in careful handwriting to Maria Castellanos, 1247 Peachtree Street, Atlanta, Georgia. She looked up at Jimmy with sudden understanding and respect. Around the cabin, military personnel in civilian clothes were beginning to take notice, their trained eyes recognizing something in Jimmy's bearing that civilian passengers missed. "Officer," Dr. Williams said, standing with the papers in her hand, "I think you need to see these documents before you make a mistake you'll regret for the rest of your career." But Martinez was beyond listening. "Ma'am, step back. This doesn't concern you." What none of them knew was that Captain Sarah Mitchell had been monitoring the situation from the cockpit. When Dr. Williams had texted her colleague about the incident, word had quickly reached the airline's crisis management team, who had contacted the flight crew about a potential discrimination lawsuit brewing in the cabin. It was time for the captain to personally assess the situation. And everything was about to change. The cockpit door opened with a soft pneumatic hiss, and Captain Sarah Mitchell stepped into the cabin. At 45, she carried herself with the unmistakable bearing of someone who had commanded aircraft in combat zones. Former Air Force, she'd flown missions over Afghanistan and Iraq before transitioning to commercial aviation. When she moved through her aircraft, passengers noticed. The cabin fell silent as she approached, her uniform crisp and commanding, silver wings catching the overhead light. She surveyed the scene, an elderly black man standing with dignity despite obvious discomfort, 2 police officers in aggressive postures, scattered papers on the floor, and a cabin full of passengers holding their breath. "Officers," she said, her voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. "What's the situation here?" Martinez straightened, suddenly aware that the dynamics had shifted. "Captain, we're removing a non-compliant passenger. He's been agitated, refusing to follow crew instructions." Captain Mitchell's eyes moved to Jimmy, taking in his military bearing, the way he stood despite obvious pain, the respectful way he addressed her without speaking. She'd seen that posture before, in the ready rooms and mess halls of military bases around the world. "Sir," she said to Jimmy, "may I see your boarding documents?" Jimmy handed over his boarding pass and ID, with movements that spoke of decades of military discipline. Captain Mitchell examined them carefully, noting the veteran designation on his driver's license. "These appear to be in order," she said. "Sir, are you military?" "Yes, ma'am," Jimmy replied, his voice carrying the automatic respect of a subordinate addressing a superior officer. "Master Sergeant James Washington, United States Marine Corps, retired." The words hit Captain Mitchell like a physical blow. Master Sergeant. That was serious enlisted leadership, the backbone of military operations. She glanced at the papers Dr. Williams was holding, and her trained eye immediately recognized the distinctive formatting of military citations. "Doctor," she said to Dr. Williams, "may I see those documents?" Dr. Williams handed over the papers, and Captain Mitchell's face changed as she read. Medal of Valor, Purple Heart, Bronze Star with V device for Valor in combat. These weren't participation trophies. These were decorations earned in blood and courage. The Medal of Valor citation was dated February 1968. Tet Offensive. Captain Mitchell's grandfather had died in Vietnam that same year. She understood immediately what she was looking at. "Master Sergeant Washington," she said, her voice now carrying a note of awe. "Is this your Medal of Valor citation?" "Yes, ma'am," Jimmy replied quietly. Captain Mitchell activated the aircraft's intercom system, her voice carrying to every seat in the plane. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Before we depart, I need to make an important announcement to our passengers and crew." Every head in the cabin turned toward the speakers. The silence was complete. "We have a very special passenger aboard this aircraft today," Captain Mitchell continued. "Master Sergeant James Washington is a recipient of the Medal of Valor, our nation's highest decoration for combat heroism. He earned this honor during the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, where he saved multiple Marines under heavy enemy fire while sustaining serious injuries himself." The words echoed through the cabin like thunder. Passengers who had been looking at their phones suddenly focused completely on the announcement. Master Sergeant Washington is traveling today to Atlanta to complete a sacred mission, delivering a letter to the family of a Marine who gave his life for our country 53 years ago. This is not a passenger causing problems. This is an American hero completing an act of honor that has taken him more than 5 decades to fulfill. As Captain Mitchell spoke, something extraordinary began to happen throughout the cabin. In row 23, Marine Lance Corporal David Chen slowly stood at attention. In row 8, Navy Chief Petty Officer Robert Thompson rose from his seat. Army Colonel Margaret Stevens in row 15 stood with perfect military bearing. Air Force Technical Sergeant Maria Rodriguez in row 35 came to attention. Coast Guard Lieutenant Sarah Morrison in row 28 stood with her hand over her heart. 5 military personnel from different branches of service, scattered throughout the aircraft, now stood in silent tribute to the Medal of Valor recipient they had unknowingly shared their flight with. Captain Mitchell looked directly at Jimmy and rendered a perfect military salute. Master Sergeant Washington, it is an honor to have you aboard my aircraft. The transformation in the cabin was instantaneous and complete. Officer Johnson immediately stepped back, his face flushed with shame. Officer Martinez stood frozen, his hand falling away from Jimmy's arm as if he'd been burned. Tom Bradley sank into his seat, his face pale. Flight attendant Rebecca covered her mouth with her hand, tears beginning to form in her eyes. The 5 military personnel maintained their positions of respect as Captain Mitchell continued. Today, we are honored to transport a true American hero as he completes one of the most sacred duties any service member can perform, ensuring that a fallen brother's final words reach his family. Dr. Williams began to applaud, slowly and deliberately. The sound spread through the cabin like ripples on water, first the passengers near her, then row by row, until the entire aircraft erupted in sustained applause. It wasn't the polite, brief clapping of airline passengers. It was the deep, heartfelt recognition of a community that had suddenly understood what they were witnessing. Jimmy stood quietly throughout the ovation, not raising his hand or acknowledging the applause. Tears ran silently down his weathered cheeks, not from embarrassment or gratitude, but from the overwhelming realization that after 53 years of carrying his burden alone, a cabin full of strangers had suddenly become witnesses to his sacred mission. Captain Mitchell waited for the applause to subside before speaking again. Master Sergeant Washington will be completing his journey in Seat 1A, with the honor and respect he has earned. If this delay means we arrive a few minutes late in Atlanta, then I will wear those minutes as a badge of honor. She clicked off the intercom and looked directly at Officers Martinez and Johnson. Gentlemen, I believe this situation has been resolved. Master Sergeant Washington will not be removed from this aircraft. In fact, he'll be traveling as our guest of honor. Officer Martinez, his face now ashen, looked at Jimmy with dawning horror at what he had almost done. Officer Johnson stepped forward, his voice barely audible. Sir, I'm a veteran too. Iraq, 2005. I should have recognized. I should have spoken up. I'm sorry. Jimmy looked at both officers with the steady gaze of someone who had seen too much of both the worst and best of humanity to hold grudges. Officer, we all make mistakes. What matters is what we learn from them. The cabin had become a sanctuary of recognition and respect. But the most powerful moment was yet to come, when Jimmy would read Tony Castellanos' letter aloud and fulfill a promise 53 years in the making. The 5 military personnel who had stood in salute now moved with quiet purpose toward the front of the aircraft. Without any spoken coordination, they formed an informal honor guard around Jimmy as Captain Mitchell personally escorted him to Seat 1A. Marine Lance Corporal David Chen approached first, extending his hand. Sir, Lance Corporal Chen, 2nd Marine Division. It's an honor to share this flight with you. Navy Chief Petty Officer Robert Thompson was next. Chief Thompson, sir. USS Enterprise. Thank you for your service and sacrifice. One by one, each service member introduced themselves, creating a bridge of respect and recognition that spanned generations and branches of military service. Jimmy shook each hand with the quiet dignity that had carried him through 7 decades of life. Officer Johnson lingered as the honor guard formed, his face etched with shame and regret. When the others had finished their introductions, he approached Jimmy hesitantly. "Sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to apologize. I'm a veteran too. Army, Iraq, 2005. I should have recognized what you were, who you were. I should have spoken up when my partner—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Jimmy placed a hand on the younger man's shoulder. "Son, I've been where you are. Following orders, trusting your partner, doing what you thought was right. The uniform doesn't protect us from making mistakes. It just makes us responsible for learning from them." Officer Martinez stood apart from the group, his earlier aggression replaced by something approaching horror. The magnitude of what he had almost done, removing a Medal of Valor recipient from an aircraft for the crime of sitting while black, was sinking in with devastating clarity. Jimmy noticed Martinez's isolation and, surprising everyone, walked over to him. "Officer Martinez," he said quietly, "my name is Jimmy Washington. What's yours?" Carlos," Martinez stammered. "Carlos Martinez." "Well, Carlos," Jimmy said, "I want you to know that my anger isn't with you personally. It's with a system that teaches us to see enemies where we should see neighbors. You've got a chance now to be part of something better." Martinez's eyes filled with tears. "My father was a Marine in Vietnam," he whispered. "He would be so ashamed of how I treated you." "Then honor his service by treating the next person with the respect your father would have shown," Jimmy replied. "That's how we break these cycles." Dr. Williams had been documenting the entire interaction, but now she put away her phone and approached Jimmy with the reverence due to a living piece of history. "Sir, I'm Dr. Patricia Williams. I want you to know that what happened here today, your dignity in the face of hatred, your grace in the moment of vindication, this is going to change people's lives." "Doc," Jimmy said with a slight smile, "I'm just trying to deliver a letter." Captain Mitchell had been coordinating with her crew throughout the intervention, and now she approached Jimmy with an update. "Master Sergeant, I've been in contact with our corporate offices. What happened today represents a complete failure of our systems and training. The company is implementing immediate changes to ensure no veteran, no person, ever faces this kind of treatment again." Flight attendant Rebecca approached the group, her face streaked with tears. "Sir, I don't know how to apologize for what I did. I let my assumptions override my training, my humanity. I'm enrolling in cultural sensitivity training, and I want you to know that I'll spend the rest of my career making sure this never happens to anyone else." Jimmy accepted her apology with the same grace he'd shown everyone else. "Rebecca, we all have biases. The question isn't whether we have them. It's whether we're willing to examine them and grow beyond them." As the aircraft taxied toward takeoff, Jimmy settled into seat 1A with the manila folder in his lap. The letter that had waited 53 years was almost home. He opened the folder and carefully removed the envelope, its edges softened by decades of handling. Captain Mitchell made one final announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, Master Sergeant Washington has graciously agreed to share with us the reason for his journey to Atlanta. He's carrying a letter written by a young Marine named Tony Castellanos, who gave his life for our country in 1968. Jimmy stood slowly, the letter in his weathered hands. The cabin fell silent as he began to read in a voice that carried across the aircraft. "Dear Maria, if you're reading this, it means I won't be coming home. I want you to know that I'm not afraid, and I'm not sorry for being here. I believe in what we're fighting for, and I believe that the Marines beside me are worth dying for. Tell Mom and Dad that I love them, and that I hope they're proud of me. But mostly, Maria, I want you to know that every day over here, I think about you becoming that teacher you always dreamed of being. Change the world, little sister. Make my sacrifice mean something. All my love, Tony." The silence that followed was profound and sacred. Then Dr. Williams began to applaud again, And once more the entire cabin joined in sustained appreciation, not just for Jimmy's courage in carrying the letter for 53 years, but for Tony Castellanos' sacrifice, and for the bonds of service and sacrifice that connect all Americans. As the applause faded, Jimmy carefully returned the letter to its envelope. In 3 hours, he would land in Atlanta and fulfill the promise he'd made in a jungle clearing half a century ago. Tony Castellanos was finally going home. Flight 447 touched down at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport at 2:47 p.m. Eastern Time. As passengers gathered their belongings and prepared to disembark, an unusual thing happened. Nobody rushed to leave the aircraft. Instead, they waited as the honor guard of military personnel escorted Jimmy toward the exit. Captain Mitchell had arranged for airport personnel to meet the flight, and as Jimmy walked through the jet bridge, he was greeted by Maria Castellanos, now 70 years old, a retired teacher, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. She had been waiting 53 years for this moment. Dr. Williams captured the sacred exchange on video as Jimmy placed Tony's letter in Maria's hands. "Mrs. Castellanos," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "your brother was thinking of you at the end. He wanted you to know he loved you, and he was proud of the teacher you became." Maria embraced Jimmy as if he were her own father. "You didn't fail him," she whispered. "You carried him home to us." The video of Flight 447's transformation went viral within hours, shared across social media platforms with hashtags like #HonorOurHeroes and #DignitaryOverHate. Officer Martinez became a vocal advocate for bias training in law enforcement. Dr. Williams launched a national initiative to combat unconscious bias in professional settings. Captain Mitchell's airline implemented the Jimmy Washington Protocol, ensuring that all veterans receive special recognition and respect. But perhaps the most powerful change happened in the hearts of ordinary people who watched the video and asked themselves a simple question. How do I see the strangers around me? Do I see their humanity? Or do I see my assumptions? Jimmy Washington returned to Chicago 3 days later, his 53-year burden finally lifted. At Tony's grave in Arlington National Cemetery, he saluted his fallen brother one last time and whispered, "Mission accomplished, Marine. You're home." The letter had been delivered. The promise had been kept. And a plane full of strangers had learned that heroes walk among us every day, carrying sacred missions we never see, until someone has the courage to look beyond the surface and recognize the truth that lives beneath. In our divided times, Jimmy Washington's story reminds us that dignity, respect, and honor aren't political positions. They're human values that connect us all. When we choose to see the hero instead of the stranger, when we choose understanding over assumption, when we choose courage over comfort, we honor not just our veterans, but the best of what America can be. Heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear modest suits and carry manila folders containing 53-year-old promises. Sometimes they sit quietly in airplane seats, waiting for the world to see past its own prejudices and recognize the sacred missions being carried out all around us. Master Sergeant James Washington taught an airplane full of people, and millions more who watched their story, that true strength isn't found in the volume of our voices or the force of our authority. It's found in the quiet dignity with which we face injustice, the grace with which we forgive those who wrong us, and the courage to keep our promises no matter how long it takes. The next time you see someone who doesn't look like they belong, ask yourself, what story are they carrying? What mission are they completing? What promises are they keeping? What sacrifices have they made that I cannot see? Because heroes walk among us every day. We just have to have the wisdom to recognize them, the humility to honor them, and the courage to stand with them when the moment demands it. Share this story if you believe every person deserves to be judged by their character, not their appearance. Share it if you believe our veterans deserve honor, not suspicion. Share it if you believe that sometimes the most important journeys happen not in first class or economy, but in the sacred space between assumption and truth. Remember Master Sergeant Jimmy Washington. Remember Private Tony Castellanos. Remember that the price of freedom isn't just paid on battlefields. It's paid every day by those who choose dignity over hatred, understanding over prejudice, and love over fear. This is more than a story about an airplane. This is a story about who we are, who we can be, and who we choose to become when nobody's watching but our own conscience. The mission continues. The promise endures. The honor remains.